My name is Amir Al Hashim, and I am 32 years old. I was born into one of the oldest royal bloodlines in Riyadh, raised behind marble walls and golden gates that the world believed represented privilege. But on the night of February 12th, 2017, inside the council chamber of my family's palace, I learned that all the gold in the world can become chains around your soul. That night, I was told that my wife, my Layla, the only person who ever made my life feel human, would no longer belong to me alone. She would be shared, as they called it, offered to four of my uncles, according to an ancient family tradition, hidden from the public eye. I remember the taste of my own breath turning metallic. I remember the way the chandelier light flickered on polished floors, as if the room itself recoiled. I remember gripping the edge of the table just to stay standing when my grandfather announced the decision with the same calmness someone might use to discuss business. In that moment, my world didn't shatter, it silently collapsed inward like a dying star, crushing everything inside me. Have you ever felt your heart scream while your body stays frozen? Have you ever watched your future turn to ash in a single sentence? I walked out of that room believing that my marriage had just been executed. I believed Layla's spirit would not survive what they intended for her. And I believed that God, whichever God I thought I served, had abandoned us completely. But I was wrong. What I thought was the end of our lives was the moment Jesus Christ began writing a story I could never have imagined. A story about freedom, about supernatural rescue, about a love stronger than dynasty or fear. A story that would cost us everything but give us more than we ever dared to hope. This is how Jesus saved my wife, my marriage, and my soul. I was born into a palace so vast that even now, years later, I can still get lost in its hallways when I remember them in my mind. My earliest memories are echoes. The sound of soldiers' boots striking marble, the murmur of distant servants, the rustle of silk garments sweeping across polished floors. People imagine royal life as a kind of endless celebration, a banquet of privileges. But when I look back on those years, all I see is a beautiful cage, one built with gold, but still a cage. I used to wake every morning to the smell of burning oud drifting through the corridors, a reminder that every day in the palace was a performance. From the moment I could speak, I was trained not to be a boy, but an heir, a symbol, a future authority, a continuation of the Al Hashim lineage. The tutors who raised me cared more about tradition than tenderness. They taught me how to recite ancient laws, how to navigate political alliances, how to look powerful even when I felt like nothing more than a frightened child hiding in his father's shadow. My grandfather was the sun our family revolved around. Stern, immovable, eyes sharp as a falcon's. His presence filled every room long before he entered it. And when he spoke, every person, including my father, lowered their gaze. He often told me stories about our bloodline, 14 generations of power, unity, and purity. I didn't understand what purity truly meant until much later. But even as a child, the way he spoke about women made my stomach tighten. They were described as vessels of honor, carriers of lineage, guardians of reputation, never partners, never human beings with their own desires. I grew up believing love was unnecessary, maybe even dangerous. In our world, love made you weak, duty kept you alive. But everything changed the day I met Layla. I still remember the first time I saw her. She stood in the palace garden during a formal family gathering, wearing a simple pale blue dress that somehow made the entire world around her look dull. She wasn't loud or dramatic, she was quiet, observant, with a grace that drew me in without effort. There was something in her eyes, something bright yet fragile, like a lantern flickering in the desert wind. Layla was 27 then, recently returned from studying literature in England. She spoke with a gentle self-assurance that both intimidated and fascinated me. When we were introduced, she looked directly into my eyes, not downward, not away, and asked me my opinion about a line of poetry. No one had ever asked for my opinion as a person before. I had always been a prince first and a human second, but Layla saw the man before the title. During our supervised meetings, I found myself falling into a world I had never known. We talked about books, about music, about the kind of life neither of us had ever been allowed to imagine. She laughed in a way that made it impossible not to smile. She listened with her whole heart, and slowly, she became the one place where I could breathe. Our wedding was a spectacle broadcast across the nation, a celebration of wealth and lineage. But what no one saw was the moment just before the ceremony, when Layla took my trembling hands in hers and whispered, "Whatever happens after this, let's promise to remain human." I didn't fully understand what she meant, but I held on to those words as though they were a lifeline. When we moved into the east wing of the palace, something beautiful happened. For the first time in my life, a place that had always felt cold and hollow felt warm. At night, Layla would read poetry aloud while the faint breeze moved the curtains. In the mornings, she would brew cardamom tea and ask about my dreams, even though I didn't know how to put most of them into words. She filled the silence of the palace with kindness, quiet, soft, persistent kindness that healed parts of me I hadn't known were wounded. I fell in love with her not suddenly, but steadily, the way dawn becomes morning without anyone noticing the exact moment the light changes. But even in our happiness, there were shadows I refused to acknowledge. Whispers I overheard, half-finished sentences exchanged among the older men of my family, hints about traditions and duties I would soon have to accept. I dismissed them then, afraid of their meaning, unwilling to imagine that the family who raised me could demand something so devastating. Back then, I believed that my love for Layla would be enough to protect us. I believed that the family who celebrated our wedding would honor our marriage. I believed I could choose my own destiny. I was naive. Our palace had always been a beautiful prison. I just hadn't realized how quickly its doors could close and how brutal the darkness inside could become. Have you ever looked back on your happiest memories and felt pain instead of joy because you didn't know how temporary they were? That was our life. Peaceful, fragile, and about to break in ways I never could have imagined. The day everything changed began like any other quiet, unassuming, wrapped in the comfortable routine Layla and I had built for ourselves inside the palace's east wing. She had brewed tea with cardamom and saffron, its aroma drifting through the room like a memory of happier mornings. She wore a soft cream-colored shawl, and her smile, gentle, sleepy, tender, felt like the reason the world existed. I kissed her forehead before stepping out, promising to return by lunchtime. At that moment, I carried nothing but peace in my heart. I had no idea I was walking into a meeting that would fracture my life. The council chamber door stood open when I arrived, a rare sign of informal expectation. But the moment I stepped inside, I realized nothing about the atmosphere was informal. The air felt heavy, as if someone had closed a window to trap every breath. My grandfather sat at the head of the long carved table, his hands resting on the polished wood like two immovable pillars. My uncles, 4 men who had shaped the structure of my childhood without ever offering affection, were seated in rigid rows, their expressions unreadable. I greeted them as custom dictated, but only my father nodded in return. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. When my grandfather finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. Amir, he said, you have enjoyed enough of your honeymoon. It is time to fulfill your duties as a son of this house. He didn't need to raise his voice. Authority was woven into every syllable. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to remain calm. What duties, grandfather? He exchanged glances with my uncles, one of those silent conversations that always made me feel like a child intruding on adult business. Then he continued, it is time to introduce Layla to the traditions that have preserved our lineage for generations. The word traditions hit me like a blow. I had heard it whispered before, in dark corridors, in hushed tones during family gatherings, but never directed at me, never spoken aloud with such finality. I swallowed hard. What traditions? Uncle Farid, the eldest of the four, leaned forward, his fingers tapping the table as if he were bored by my ignorance. The tradition all wives in this family follow, he said, especially women of high significance. They serve the family, not just the husband. The word serve made my pulse hammer in my ears. I felt suddenly cold, like the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. My grandfather's expression didn't change as he delivered the sentence that would unravel our world. Layla will be shared among your uncles, according to age and seniority. You will prepare her. The schedule begins next week. For a moment, my mind refused to process the words. They sounded like something from a distant nightmare, familiar yet impossible. Share my wife, offer her body to men decades older than her, men whose eyes had never held an ounce of respect for anything soft or gentle. My chair scraped loudly against the floor as I stood too quickly. No, I said, the word escaping like a breath torn from my chest. Grandfather, no. Layla is my wife. Our marriage, your marriage is a link in a chain older than you, he interrupted, his tone still maddeningly calm. A chain forged by our ancestors. Your grandmother served 3 brothers. Your great-grandmother served 4. This is our way. I felt the room tilt. My hands trembled. But Islam favors obedience to the elders. Uncle Samir snapped. You would question our authority? You would question the will of God expressed through your own blood? I wanted to shout, to overturn the table, to break every tradition that had been twisted into chains, but shock strangled my voice. Instead, I whispered, Layla doesn't know. You hid this from her. My grandfather's eyes hardened. We hid nothing. Her father made the arrangement. He agreed to her role before the marriage. She belongs to our house now, as do you. The last 3 words slammed into me with brutal clarity. As do you. My entire life, I had served my family with unquestioning loyalty. But this was a line I could not cross. When I spoke again, my voice was shaking, but firm. I will not allow it. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Uncle Farid's chair scraped across the floor. As he stood and leaned so close to me, I could smell the bitterness of coffee on his breath. You think you have a choice? He hissed. Your wife will do as she is told. You will do as you are told, or you will lose everything. I glanced at my father, searching desperately for support, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. He looked away, shame tightening his jaw. That was when I realized I was alone. When I finally staggered back toward the east wing, my legs felt numb. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if I were walking into my own execution. I prayed Layla would be reading poetry in the sunlight when I found her, that her smile would steady me. But the moment she saw my face, her expression changed. She set her book down slowly. Amir, she whispered, what happened? I knelt beside her, took her hands, and told her everything. Her silence afterward was worse than any scream. Her eyes filled with tears that fell silently, one by one, like drops of grief carving into stone. She pulled her hands from mine, wrapped her arms around herself, and began to tremble violently. "I trusted you," she choked out. "I trusted that you would keep me safe." Her words pierced me. "Layla, I didn't know." "But they knew," she whispered. "My father knew. Your family knew. Everyone knew except me." She collapsed into the nearest chair, sobbing so deeply her whole body shook. And I, helpless, furious, devastated, could do nothing but kneel beside her and let her grief wash over us both. Have you ever felt powerless to protect the one person you love most? Have you ever watched the light in someone's eyes fade because of something you couldn't undo? That night, Layla cried herself to sleep in my arms while I stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of palace life continuing as if our world hadn't just been shattered. My chest ached with the unbearable truth. I could not save her, not from them, not from their laws, not from the darkness woven into the very walls of the home we lived in. For the first time, I realized my love alone was not enough. And that realization was the beginning of my collapse. In the days that followed, our home inside the East Wing felt less like a sanctuary and more like a room slowly filling with water. Every hour brought us closer to the moment Layla would be taken from me, not permanently, but in a way that was even more horrifying. The palace corridors that once echoed with warmth now felt like hallways in a labyrinth designed for torment. I could barely breathe inside them. Layla hardly slept. When she did, she jolted awake with a cry that tore something inside me every time. I tried to comfort her, to hold her, to whisper promises I wasn't sure I could keep, but she would only look at me with hollow eyes that seemed to ask a question I couldn't bear to answer. "Why can't you stop this?" One evening, 3 days before my uncle Farid was scheduled to claim his right, I came back from speaking with one of the palace imams, another dead end, another justification for obedience, and found Layla sitting on the cold floor of the bathroom. The lights were dim, the marble tiles casting a pale reflection of her trembling body. She didn't look up when I entered. Her hands were shaking. In one of them, she held a razor blade. My heart stopped. The world around me dissolved into silence so thick I couldn't even hear my own breath. I knelt in front of her slowly, afraid that one wrong movement might shatter the fragile thread keeping her alive. "Layla," I whispered, "put it down, please." She lifted her gaze to mine, and I will never forget what I saw there. Not fear, not anger, but emptiness. The kind of emptiness that comes when a soul has been pushed farther than it was ever meant to go. "I can't do this, Amir," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. "I would rather die as your wife than live as theirs." My vision blurred. I reached for her hands gently, terrified she might pull away, but she didn't resist. The blade slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the floor. I wrapped my arms around her, feeling how light she had become, as though she were disappearing piece by piece. I held her until her sobs quieted, but her breathing stayed shallow, fragile, as if life itself was slipping through her grasp. That night, when she finally fell asleep, exhausted, trembling, the imprint of fear still carved into her features, I stepped outside into the courtyard garden. The air was cool, but my body felt feverish. The jasmine flowers surrounding me were the same ones that had witnessed our early days of peace and laughter. Now they felt like silent witnesses to a tragedy neither of us had chosen. I knelt on the stone path, my hands pressed against the ground, and for the first time in my life, prayer poured out of me not as ritual, but as a desperate cry from a drowning man. "Allah," I whispered. If you are real, if you are merciful, please show me what to do. Help me save her. Please help me. Nothing. No breeze, no sign, no shift in my spirit. Just silence, the kind of silence that made the world feel hollow. I tried again, louder this time, my voice cracking. Where are you? The jasmine trembled in the faint wind, but there was no answer. And a terrifying realization began to wrap its fingers around my chest. The God I had worshipped through memorized words and strict rituals felt a million miles away. Have you ever prayed until your voice broke, only to feel like your cries were hitting the ceiling and falling back onto your own shoulders? That night, I tasted that kind of despair for the first time. I sank deeper onto the stone path, my hands trembling. I thought of Layla's hollow eyes, her shaking hands, the razor blade glinting like a verdict. I thought of my uncles, their cruel entitlement. I thought of my grandfather's cold certainty. Something inside me cracked completely. God, I whispered, but my voice was not directed toward the heavens, only toward the night itself. If you exist, if there is any God who listens, I need help. I can't save her alone. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider a truth I had never dared to imagine. Perhaps the God I had been taught to follow was not the only one who could hear the cry of a desperate heart. The morning after that night of broken prayers, something unexpected happened, something so ordinary on the surface that I didn't recognize it as the beginning of a supernatural rescue. My phone buzzed on the bedside table as sunlight crept through the curtains. Layla was still asleep beside me, her breathing unsteady but calmer than the night before. I reached for the phone, thinking it might be another message from the family council, another threat, another warning, but it wasn't. It was an invitation. A business associate from Dubai, his name was Omar, had asked if I would attend an international finance conference on short notice. He insisted it was important, strategic, time-sensitive, the kind of request that would normally require weeks of protocol, but for some reason, my grandfather approved it almost instantly. Take Layla, he said without emotion. Let her enjoy herself before she begins her responsibilities here. I felt sick when he said that, her responsibilities. The phrase echoed in my skull like a deep bruise being pressed. But as I walked back toward our chambers, something inside me whispered that this trip was more than it appeared. Maybe it was an escape route. Maybe it was mercy disguised as business. Maybe someone somewhere was listening already. When I told Layla that she could come with me, a faint spark lit her eyes. It wasn't joy, it was relief. A breath of oxygen in a drowning room. Even just a few days away, she whispered. Feels like a miracle. And maybe it was Dubai was a shimmering jewel against the desert, open skies, modern streets, people from everywhere. No palace walls, no ancestral shadows pressing against our backs. For the first time in weeks, Layla walked with her shoulders straight, her steps not weighed down by terror. She even smiled once, a small, fragile thing, but real. On the second day of the conference, during a dinner break, we met him, Daniel Thompson, an American in his 50s with graying hair, warm eyes, and a presence that felt strangely safe. He noticed Layla first, not in a way that objectified her, but in a way that recognized pain. He approached our table slowly, respectfully. I hope you don't mind me saying this, he said gently, but your wife, she looks like someone carrying a very heavy burden. Are you both all right? His voice wasn't intrusive. It wasn't curious. It was compassionate. And compassion is dangerous for people who are trying to hide their suffering. Because kindness breaks walls we spent years building. Layla's eyes brimmed with tears before she could answer. She excused herself, leaving me alone with Daniel at the table. Something inside me cracked open, just enough to let words slip out. "She's not all right," I admitted, my voice shaking. "And I don't know how to help her." Daniel listened with a stillness that almost unnerved me. When I finished explaining carefully, cautiously, afraid to reveal too much, he didn't judge, he didn't gasp, he didn't offer cliches. He simply said, "Amir, what your wife is enduring is not the will of any loving God." His words stunned me. They were simple, but they hit me harder than anything I'd heard in years. A loving God. The phrase felt foreign to my soul. Daniel continued, "In my faith, in the Christian faith, marriage is sacred. A husband's role is to protect, love, and cherish his wife. Ephesians chapter 5 says, 'Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her.'" Gave himself up? The words felt like sunlight piercing through smoke. No one in my life had ever taught me that love meant sacrifice, that power meant protection, that authority meant responsibility, not entitlement. That night, after Layla fell asleep in the hotel room, I sat in the dark with Daniel's words echoing in my mind. I opened my phone and typed, "Christian view of marriage," then "Jesus protects women," then Ephesians 5, then without fully understanding why I searched, "Does Jesus hear desperate prayers?" I've read for hours, page after page, story after story, verse after verse, grace, mercy, compassion, not the cold traditions of my ancestors, not the heavy silence I felt in the garden, not the crushing obedience that demanded my wife's dignity. Instead, love, freedom, a God who sees, a Savior who intervenes. I didn't know it yet, but the first seed had been planted. Layla noticed the change in me the next day. As we walked beside the ocean, waves curling around our footsteps, I whispered to her what I had read. Her eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but of wonder. "A God who protects women," she murmured. "A God who values marriage. A God who loves." I nodded. Maybe we're not alone in this. For the first time since the nightmare began, her hand tightened around mine. We didn't know it then, but Jesus had already entered our story, quietly, tenderly, through a stranger, through a verse, through hope. Seeds of salvation were already taking root, deep beneath the terror, beneath the palace shadows, beneath our breaking hearts. I didn't know it then, but I was standing at the edge of the moment that would change everything: my marriage, my destiny, my soul. It happened on our last night in Dubai, after another long day of walking the shoreline with Layla, both of us clinging to the fragile hope Daniel had planted. She fell asleep early, her breathing steady for the first time in weeks. There was something peaceful about the way she rested, as if just being outside the reach of my family's shadow had given her a few hours of borrowed life. I sat by the window of our hotel room, staring out at the glittering city below. Cars hissed through the streets like silver serpents. The lights of skyscrapers blinked against the night sky. Everything around me felt alive, yet inside I felt like I was dissolving. Hope and despair warred within me until I couldn't tell which was louder. I thought about my grandfather's calm cruelty, my uncle's hunger disguised as tradition, the razor blade in Layla's trembling hand, the silence in the garden. And somewhere between memory and agony, I whispered a name I had never spoken with intention. "Jesus, if you're real." The words trembled out of me, half prayer, half desperation. "If you're out there, if you can hear me, Help us. I can't save her. I can't save myself. Please. I didn't know how Christians prayed. I didn't know if I was doing it wrong. I didn't know if heaven would strike me down or ignore me completely. All I knew was that I was drowning, and every God I had ever cried out to had left me unheard. Then something happened. The air shifted. Not dramatically, not like thunder or wind or an earthquake. It was subtle, like the atmosphere itself exhaled. A warmth began to fill the room, starting near the ceiling and descending slowly, gently, like sunlight filtering through water. I straightened in my chair, my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't afraid. That was the strangest part. I had lived my whole life afraid of authority, of failure, of dishonor, of disobedience. But in that moment, every fear inside me silenced. It was as if peace had a presence. And then I heard it. A voice, not loud, not external, not booming like thunder. It was inside me, inside my bones, inside my thoughts, inside my breath, yet not coming from me. Amir, just my name, spoken with such tenderness that my entire body broke open with emotion. I stood slowly, not knowing whether I was moving or being moved. The room glowed, not brightly, but warmly, like every shadow had bowed away. Then the voice spoke again. I have seen your pain. My knees gave out. I sank to the floor, trembling, tears blurring my vision. I wasn't praying anymore, I was unraveling. I have seen Layla's suffering. A sob tore out of my chest. I pressed a hand against my mouth to stifle the sound, afraid of waking her, afraid she might miss this moment that felt too holy for my unworthy hands. And then, like a hand placed on my shattered heart, the voice said, "You were never meant to carry this alone." Warmth washed over me, waves of it, peace so deep it felt like being held by something infinite. I don't know how long I knelt there, crying without shame, without fear, without restraint. Every wound, every terror, every failure poured out of me like water from a broken vessel. Then, in the quiet that followed, I felt it. Love, not a feeling, a presence, a person, Jesus, not the distant prophet I had been taught to name but never know, not the forbidden figure whispered about in warnings, not an idea, a reality, alive, near, reaching for me. In that holy silence, one final whisper touched my spirit, gentle as breath. I will make a way. Not I might, not I will try. I will. And I believed him, not because I understood, but because my soul recognized the truth before my mind could argue. When I finally lifted my head, the room looked the same furniture, same curtains, same dim lamp, but I was not the same. I felt rebuilt, filled with a strength that wasn't mine, filled with a peace that made no sense, filled with a certainty that Jesus had truly heard me and that he was already moving. I didn't know how he would save us. I didn't know what miracle would unfold. But for the first time in my life, I believed we wouldn't walk into the darkness alone. When we returned to Riyadh, I expected fear to crush the fragile peace Jesus had given me. But something inside me had shifted. The palace gates no longer looked like the jaws of a beast, though they still were, but now I walked through them with a strange confidence humming beneath my ribs. It was as if invisible hands steadied me, reminding me of the whisper I heard in that hotel room. I will make a way. Layla sensed the change too. She held my hand a little tighter as we stepped inside the marble foyer. You're different, she whispered. Your eyes, they look alive again. I didn't know how to explain what had happened without frightening her. so I simply said, "We're not alone anymore." But the palace noticed the shift too. My uncles glared at me with suspicion when they saw that my posture was no longer bowed. My grandfather watched me with calculating eyes, as if trying to identify what had broken his hold on my obedience. The very next morning, he summoned me. When I stepped into his study, the air felt sharp, like a blade drawn across stone. "Amir," he said coldly, "your resistance ends today. If you refuse to fulfill your duties, you will be stripped of your inheritance, your influence, your name. Do you understand?" Something inside me wanted to be afraid, but something deeper, a strength not my own, kept my voice steady. "I will not sacrifice my wife," I said softly. "I won't give her up to anyone. Not for tradition, not for lineage, not for you." He slammed his hand on the desk. "You dare defy 14 generations? I follow a different voice now." I answered before I fully realized what I was saying. For a split second, fear flickered across his face. Not fear of me, but fear of losing control. And control is the only thing tyrants truly worship. That evening, guards were assigned to our hallway. Doors were locked from the outside. Our phones were confiscated. We were prisoners. But even in that prison, Jesus was already at work. Layla and I knelt together in our room, whispering prayers I barely knew how to form. "Jesus," I breathed, "you said you would make a way. Show us what to do." An hour later, the first miracle came. Our landline, disconnected by palace orders, rang. Not buzzed, not glitched, rang. I froze. Layla covered her mouth, eyes wide. When I picked it up, a familiar voice whispered urgently, "Amir, it's Daniel." My heart stopped. How did you even reach us?" "I don't know," he said. "I've been trying all day. The line shouldn't work, but suddenly it went through. Listen carefully. Your only chance is tonight. I have contacts ready to move, but you must leave within hours." It was impossible. And yet, it wasn't. Not with what I had experienced. Not after that voice in Dubai. We moved quickly, silently. Layla grabbed only what mattered, her passport, a few clothes, and the small notebook where she wrote her poems about freedom she had never lived. I hid the cash we had secretly collected from her jewelry. When midnight struck, the second miracle arrived. The palace lights flickered once, twice, then went completely dark. I heard guards cursing in the hall, scrambling to fix the electrical failure. But what no one realized was that the security system had gone out too. Cameras, locks, alarms, all dead. Layla grabbed my arm. "Amir, this is him." I didn't question it. I felt it. The same peace that had filled that hotel room now filled the darkness around us. We slipped out of the door and moved through the hallway like shadows. Every guard who could have stopped us was occupied, some arguing over the generator, others chasing false alarms triggered by the blackout. It was as if obstacles dissolved moments before we reached them. Outside, the courtyard was swallowed in darkness. Only moonlight guided our path. And strangely, the moon seemed brighter than usual, so bright it illuminated the narrow servants' passage leading toward the back gate. A single car was parked there, engine quietly purring. A driver I'd never seen before leaned out and whispered, "Hurry, no time." We climbed in, the door shut, and as the car rolled silently into the night, I felt something inside me break open, relief, disbelief, awe. I looked back at the palace shrinking into the distance. "It's over," I whispered. "We're really leaving." But the driver shook his head. "Not yet. They'll notice soon. We must reach the airstrip before they track you." As he drove, Layla rested her head on my shoulder. Amir, she whispered, before you woke me tonight, I had a dream. Jesus was standing at our door. He said, do not fear, I go before you. Tears burned my eyes because I believed her, every word. At the private airstrip, a small jet waited with its lights dimmed. A man stood at the stairs, broad-shouldered, familiar silhouette. Daniel, he hugged us both. You're safe now, he said with a trembling voice. Jesus has carried you out of Egypt. As the plane lifted off, I looked down at the kingdom that had once owned me. The city lights looked small, almost fragile. So fragile that for the first time in my life, I realized the truth. Powerful families can cage your body. Oppressive traditions can break your spirit. But when Jesus moves, no chains can hold, no gate can stand, no empire can stop his rescue. Layla took my hand as the clouds swallowed the horizon. Amir, he really saved us. And with a trembling breath of awe, I whispered back, yes, he did. The country where our plane landed wasn't grand or majestic. It wasn't wrapped in royal expectations or generations of tradition. It was quiet, humble, full of people who didn't know our names and didn't care that we had once lived inside marble walls. For the first time in my life, I stepped onto foreign soil, without bodyguards, without servants, without titles, and yet I felt freer than I had ever felt as a prince. Layla breathed in the cool night air and began to cry softly at first, then with full, trembling release. They were not tears of fear, they were tears of relief, of survival, of rebirth. Daniel met us with members of his church, people holding warm blankets instead of paperwork, compassion instead of suspicion. They didn't treat us like fugitives. They didn't look at Layla like she was damaged. They welcomed us like family. They prayed for us with tears in their eyes, as if our suffering mattered to them, as if we mattered. In the weeks that followed, we stayed in a small apartment above the church, nothing extravagant, nothing polished, but filled with peace that seeped into the cracks of our broken hearts. Layla began attending women's gatherings, and for the first time since our wedding, I saw her laugh without fear. Sometimes I would wake in the night to find her sitting at the window, whispering prayers to Jesus with a softness I had never heard in her voice. She was healing, and so was I. 3 months later, we were baptized. I will never forget the moment I stepped into the baptismal water. It was lukewarm, shallow, almost ordinary, yet something supernatural lingered in the air. Pastor Williams placed a hand on my shoulder and said, Amir, you are not who you were. In Christ, you are made new. When he lowered me beneath the water, it felt like drowning the version of myself that had been shaped by fear, tradition, and the expectations of a dynasty. And when I rose again, for the first time in my life, I felt clean, whole, free. Layla's baptism was even more powerful. As she came up from the water, she covered her face with trembling hands and began to cry, not the tears of sorrow I had known so well, but tears of pure, radiant joy. I'm not their possession anymore, she whispered. I belong to Jesus. That day, our marriage changed, not because of loss, but because of love. We learned how to serve each other instead of a heritage. We learned how to forgive. We learned how to pray. We learned that freedom isn't the absence of chains. It's the presence of Jesus. Today, our life looks nothing like the royal world we came from. We live simply. I work in a community center helping refugees navigate new beginnings. Layla teaches English to women escaping abuse and oppression. We don't have servants or wealth or prestige. What we have is peace, real peace, the kind that doesn't rise and fall with circumstance. And now, if you're watching this, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt trapped by expectations you didn't choose? Have you ever believed you were unworthy of love? Have you ever wondered if God hears your cries in the darkest nights? I am living proof that He does. If Jesus could reach into a palace filled with fear, tradition, and control, if He could rescue a prince who felt powerless and a wife who felt invisible, if He could break chains that had existed for 14 generations, then He can reach you too, right where you are. You are not too far. Your story is not too broken. Your pain is not too deep. Jesus sees you. Jesus loves you. Jesus can save you. If you need prayer, leave a comment below. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more testimonies of what Jesus is doing around the world. And remember this, you are not alone. Freedom is real. Hope is real. And His name is Jesus Christ.